When a young, pregnant Massachusetts woman is found dead in 2021, local police write off her death as a suicide. However, the findings of a medical examiner hired by her family prompt the FBI to step in and perform an expert investigation of their own. Federal authorities charge a disgraced police officer with the premeditated murder of a young woman they say he had abused for years in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
We're airing this extra episode on the 5th anniversary of this podcast. We aired our very first episode on December 10th, 2019. So before we get into today's story, Scott and I want to sincerely thank all of you for listening.
Yeah, it's almost unbelievable that we've been able to do it for 5 years now.
Right, never missed an episode. This podcast is made meaningful by the fact that people take time to listen to these stories, and we truly appreciate all of you. We hope you'll stick around for another 5 years, and most importantly, we hope that if you have any information on any of the cases we cover, that you'll report it to investigators. We also hope that if you think bringing stories like the ones we cover to the public's attention is important, you'll take a quick moment to leave Last Seen Alive a rating or review on whatever app you're using to listen. For those of you who've already done so, thank you so much. It makes a big difference. Now, on to today's story. It's a little different than the cases we typically cover in that it's not unsolved. Someone has been charged with this victim's murder already and will soon be going on trial. However, in many ways, this case is still unresolved. So we're covering this case for a couple reasons. Firstly, because we believe firmly that law enforcement officers who abuse their positions of power, especially in ways as heinous as those we're about to discuss, should not expect to be able to go quietly about life as usual. They should expect to be found out, expect to be prosecuted for any criminal offenses, and expect to face intense public shaming.
With a big emphasis on the public shaming, it goes pretty far.
Right, their reputation should precede them if they ever attempt to regain employment anywhere as a law enforcement officer, and media coverage plays a large role in that last part. New England news organizations like Boston Magazine and Boston.com have already been delivering with high-quality, in-depth reporting on this case. And this episode is our small contribution to the public attention we believe cases like these deserve. I also think that the victim in this case deserves the sympathy she was repeatedly denied in life, even if it's from strangers and comes after her death. Lastly, but certainly not least, although it's too late to help the victim in this case, I hope that we can ensure that a little bit of good comes from telling her story. More on that at the conclusion of this episode. For now, a quick heads up. This episode contains discussion of sexual assault, including sexual crimes against a child. We'll avoid going into the more graphic details available, but the content is still upsetting. This episode also contains discussion of suicide. Please listen with care. Sandra Birchmore was last seen alive on February 1st, 2021. She was 23 years old at the time and lived in Stoughton, Massachusetts. However, this story begins years earlier. In order to understand the depth and depravity of the abuse that ultimately ended in her murder, we have to go all the way back. Sandra, an only child, was born during a difficult time in her mom Denise's life. Denise had been married, but her husband had tragically died at the age of just 42. 2 years later, in 1997, Denise gave birth to her first and only child, a baby girl who she named Sandra. Sandra's dad wasn't in the picture at all, not during the pregnancy and not after her birth. Denise gave Sandra her own last name, which was also that of her late husband, Birchmore. Now, single parenthood is a tremendous undertaking for anyone, but for Denise, there was an extra layer of difficulty because she suffered from a chronic illness. Because of that illness, she would end up dying in middle age, much like her husband. Meanwhile, though, she raised Sandra to the best of her ability. She loved her daughter and took on jobs, such as that of a payroll clerk, to support her. It wasn't easy without a second parent in the picture, but Denise had allies in the form of her parents, Claire and Gerald. A quick clarifying note here. An in-depth article published in Boston Magazine states that Denise's parents weren't actually her biological parents, but rather a significantly older sibling and their spouse. So this would make them Sandra's biological aunt and uncle rather than her grandparents, but that's only a technicality. It's clear that Denise considered Claire and Gerald to be her parents and Sandra's grandparents. They're even described this way in Denise's obituary. So throughout this episode, I'll be referring to Claire and Gerald as Sandra's grandparents because that's who she knew them as. Now, with that being said, Claire and Gerald were always there for Denise and Sandra. There were times when Denise's illness prevented her from being able to afford to rent on her own, and on those occasions, Claire and Gerald always welcomed Denise and Sandra into their home. Claire and Gerald also served as role models for Sandra, with Gerald being the only father-like figure in Sandra's life. She deeply admired her grandfather, who was a World War II veteran. He'd served in the U.S. Army, earning a variety of medals for his honorable service overseas. It was Sandra's admiration for all that he'd accomplished that led to her developing an interest in and an admiration for uniformed services of all kinds. Eventually, in particular, she came to admire police officers, and from a young age, she dreamed of becoming one herself. This interest persisted for years. It was Sandra's big childhood dream. And Scott, I can't help but think of when our daughter was younger and went through a phase where she had the same dream, back when you guys would bring me lunch at work, and she'd get really excited to visit and try to direct traffic from the sidewalk in front of the department.
Yeah, there's fond memories of her yelling stop at the top of her lungs and holding her hand out so adamantly, even though she was, 400 yards away from the vehicle and 4 years old.
Now, unfortunately, I don't have any stories like that to tell you about Sandra when she was little, because the adults who raised her died before she did, despite the fact that she barely got to experience adulthood. She lost all of her parental figures early in life, so they're not here to tell those kind of stories about Sandra, which is a shame because Sandra was dehumanized by her abusers from a criminally young age. I'd really like to have some cute little stories to tell about when she was little, stories that would humanize her, give a glimpse into her life outside the scope of the horrible events that led to its end, and make it easier for listeners to relate her to the kids in their lives that they care about. Nonetheless, it's my hope that as we progress with this story, everyone listening will keep the young, innocent child that Sandra was when this all began in mind. By the time Sandra turned 12, she'd been begging her mom for quite a while to let her join something called the Police Explorers Program, which is a vocational program for kids designed to teach them about police careers. It was created by the Boy Scouts, or as that organization is known now, Scouting America. Many sources I checked say that the Police Explorers Program cadets need to be at least 14 years old to participate. However, Sandra was only 12 when she became involved in the program. Her mom, Denise, had been on the fence about it, possibly because Sandra was so young and had a long history of being bullied by other kids. She had always struggled to make friends. Part of this was due to the fact that Sandra, an only child who often lived with her World War II-era grandparents, seemed to have an easier time getting along with adults than other kids. And the fact that she and her mom had to move frequently likely contributed too. Former middle school teachers of Sandra's interviewed by a journalist writing for Boston Magazine say that she came to school smelling heavily of cigarette smoke, thanks to the fact that all of the adults in her life were heavy smokers. And despite the best efforts of her mom and grandparents, who were chronically ill and elderly respectively, her behavior suggested that she suffered from neglect at home. One teacher described her as, quote, a child starved for attention, end quote.
Honestly, pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, and for example, Sandra wasn't adverse to stretching the truth in an effort to fit in with her classmates. She was one of those kids who would exaggerate a lot, or sometimes make up stories. But her classmates saw right through those attempts, and they were cruel to her. She was the kid who smelled unpleasant, whose desperate attempts to fit in only distanced her further from her classmates, and who everyone seemed to pick on. None of that was her fault, of course, but middle school bullies are notoriously ruthless. Sandra was also witty and smart, according to family members, but her classmates didn't see those qualities. They were hidden behind a haze of secondhand smoke, social awkwardness, and desperation for acceptance. Sandra was never afforded a chance for her personality to shine at school. Sandra longed to join the Explorers program, where she hoped that she would, finally, for once, fit in. She wanted so badly to be a police officer one day. Surely that would be enough to finally help her connect with other kids who had the same interest, and surely her mentors in the program would appreciate her enthusiasm.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense actually, because it's putting you in a group with people with your similar interests and it's introducing you in a more neutral ground.
Right, on the surface, it sounds like a great idea for a child like this. So Denise eventually agreed to let Sandra join. Denise had attended and graduated from a local parenting program designed to help vulnerable families, but even so, her daughter was still struggling despite her efforts to become a more capable parent. It was painful to watch her daughter suffer as a class outcast. Any parent's heart would ache for their child in such a situation, so it's easy to see why Denise might have been persuaded to allow Sandra to finally join the program.
I know from personal experience, whenever the kids are very excited about something, it's almost impossible to bring yourself to tell them no.
Right. So, with her mom's permission, Sandra was put on a wait list for the program and became a standby member at age 12. At first, things seemed to be going okay. Sandra was enthusiastic about the program, and every meeting made her feel as if she was one step closer to finally achieving her ultimate dream, becoming a police officer. But in 2012, by which time Sandra was 14, a man named Matthew Farwell was hired by the Stoughton Police Department. Farwell was 26 years old at the time and had previously worked at another police department before applying to Stoughton. In Sandra's eyes, Farwell was about as cool as it got. Not only was he a police officer, as she aspired to be one day, but he'd been a cadet in the Explorer program when he'd been younger, just like her.
Okay, so it's already starting to form those bonds mentally.
Right, he was proof that being an explorer could lead to a real career in law enforcement, which was, of course, still her biggest dream. Plus, he'd served in the military prior to getting into law enforcement. Like her World War II veteran grandfather, he'd been a soldier in the U.S. Army.
So even more reason to trust him.
Yeah, she saw him as a real role model. And by the way, speaking of Sandra's beloved grandfather, he would die just months later at about the time of her 15th birthday. This loss would be devastating to Sandra. He'd been the only father-like figure she'd ever known. Now, meanwhile, when Farwell had become an instructor in the Explorers program, he had noticed Sandra's genuine enthusiasm for police work and, she thought, her potential as a future law enforcement officer. He became her personal role model, paying special attention to her, sending her a friend request on Facebook, and even meeting up with her outside of the program in a nearby library to help her with her homework. Sandra was easily impressed by how much he seemed to care. The kids at school didn't accept her, but so what? Her new friend did, and he was everything she aspired to be one day. He was exponentially cooler than the kids who bullied her, as far as she was concerned. His only immediately apparent flaw was his criminally bad haircut, but Sandra couldn't have cared less about that. After years of always being the butt of the joke at school, she finally fit in somewhere. Of course, Scott, Farwell was not some benevolent role model who wanted to see a vulnerable but promising child succeed. If he was, we wouldn't be doing this episode. Rather, he was a predator. He picked up on her desire for attention and acceptance like a shark sensing blood in the water. The special attention, the Facebook friendship, the study sessions in the local library, all of that, FBI investigators say, was grooming.
While some of it seems okay on the surface, it really does lend a lot of access to a vulnerable individual. It definitely fits that criteria.
Yes, it does, and he had ulterior motivations, and they were bad. In 2013, when Sandra was 15 years old, still grieving the loss of her grandfather and perhaps even more vulnerable than ever before, Farwell, who was 27 years old, began sexually assaulting her. After all of the grooming she'd been subjected to, Sandra went along with it. It made her feel even more special. But under Massachusetts law, she couldn't consent to sex. There was a legal term for what Farwell was doing, and that legal term was statutory rape. According to federal court documents related to this case, including a motion for detention, Farwell repeatedly engaged in unlawful sexual intercourse with Sandra, beginning when she was 15 and lasting for the rest of her short life. About a month after that initial act of sexual assault, Farwell got married. Presumably, his wife suspected none of this. Over the years, as they had children of their own, Farwell continued sexually exploiting Sandra. What's worse, according to scores of text messages which FBI investigators retrieved, Farwell was a sexual sadist who subjected Sandra to sexual violence, such as choking. Additionally, he reportedly used violent sex acts to punish her for things like getting bad grades. Reportedly, he also relished rape fantasies and would sometimes order Sandra to resist him during their sexual encounters, sometimes while pretending to be an even younger child than she actually was. He enjoyed incestuous rape fantasies in particular, which in my opinion is especially concerning knowing that he had children at home.
Yeah, that is all bad, but when you think about this as somebody that's raising children, it's even worse. He's exactly the person that you don't want to get into law enforcement that gets in because of the power trip.
Yes, exactly. So to somehow make all of this even worse, FBI investigators say that Farwell conducted these sexual activities on the clock. So not only was he exploiting a child, he was neglecting his duties as a police officer while he did so.
He tainted every aspect of law enforcement.
Yes, he did. Now, Sandra and Farwell were in virtually constant communication via text. Also, like a true abusive control freak, Farwell tracked Sandra's location via her cell phone. That way, if she lied to him or did anything else he didn't like, he could punish her sexually. Scott, there are some text message transcripts, excerpts publicly available that illustrate how Farwell spoke to Sandra. A lot of the messages are crude and sexual, and I'm not going to read them here. However, there's one thing those explicit messages disclose, which I feel is important to mention. Farwell, according to his own messages, regretted not sexually assaulting Sandra even sooner at an even younger age. As I mentioned, Sandra never escaped Farwell. According to federal prosecutors, his abusive stranglehold on her life eventually became literal and fatal. But he wasn't the only Stoughton police officer who exploited her, merely the first. Others included Farwell's twin brother, William Farwell, who had also joined the police department as an officer. In order to prevent confusion, I'm going to refer to William Farwell as Farwell's twin. So to be clear, when I say Farwell's twin, I am not talking about her alleged killer. Farwell's twin allegedly knew about his brother's abuse of Sandra and did nothing to help her. What's worse, he began having sexual encounters with her himself after she had turned 18 years old. While these sex acts weren't criminal due to her age, they were certainly in violation of departmental policy.
Even without sexually assaulting her as a minor, the fact that he knows that this is going on and he is covering up for his brother and not doing what anybody should be doing in this situation, especially when you consider the fact that he's also a law enforcement officer.
Right.
It is incredibly disgraceful.
I feel similarly. Crime or not, Farwell's twin used his position of power as a police officer to sexually exploit a teenager who he reportedly knew was the victim of long-term sexual grooming and abuse. What's more, according to reporting by CBS News, an internal investigation found that he spent a good deal of his on-duty time engaging in sexually explicit text conversations with Sandra. In addition to Farwell and his twin, another cop, Officer Robert Devine, who ran the Stoughton Police Explorers program, also allegedly engaged in sex with Sandra. He'd known Sandra since her introduction to the program at age 12. However, his alleged sexual contact with her didn't begin until after she'd turned 18.
It's like they think that waiting until she was 18 somehow made it okay. They knew what they were doing was wrong, and they waited till she was 18 so they could morally justify it to themselves. They're disgraceful.
Yeah, they definitely knew that what they were doing was wrong. That's why they were so secretive about it. And there was another one of them. A Stoughton animal control officer named Joshua Heel also had sex with Sandra after she reached the age of 18. So basically, Scott, what's alleged here is that there were several officers at the Stoughton Police Department who, 1, knew about Matthew Farwell grooming and sexually exploiting Sandra, and 2, rather than reporting it or taking any steps to protect her, allowed it to go on and decided to join in on the ongoing exploitation themselves once she became a legal adult.
These were people that were trusted by the community to run this program, and they just saw it as a vending machine for picking people to exploit.
Yeah. Now, most of Sandra's abusers were cops, but not all. As Sandra got older, she expressed interest in serving in the Army. She felt it would give her valuable work experience and enhance her chances of landing a job as a police officer afterward. Plus, she would be able to serve her country much as her late grandfather had. So, Farwell, an Army veteran himself, introduced her to a friend of his.
Of course he did.
Yeah, according to reporting published in Boston Magazine, that friend was an Army Reserve recruiter working in nearby Quincy, Massachusetts. And Scott, guess what happened when Farwell introduced the two of them?
He started exploiting her also.
Yeah. One of the first things the recruiter did was send Sandra a Facebook friend request, which, as far as the Army is concerned, is considered fraternization and is against policy. And at some point, the recruiter had sex with her. A recording of this encounter was made and shared with Farwell. Now, all of these men, allegedly, treated Sandra and her exploitation as one big joke. They traded videos and pictures and laughed at the vulnerable teenager who had come to them wanting one day to serve her community or country. Sandra never got to join the Army, nor did she ever get to become a police officer. Every effort she made to achieve her dreams, to achieve some degree of success or happiness, to accomplish something she could be proud of, resulted in the men whose professional role and responsibility it was to guide and support her sexually exploiting her instead. Sandra apparently couldn't have or do anything without being taken advantage of. And there would be no escape. All of her dreams and aspirations were exploited, and that was all she'd ever known. And it would be no different when, as a young woman in her early 20s, she set her sights on a new goal, which seemed more achievable than the others: motherhood. By that point in her life, Sandra was working as a teacher's assistant at a local elementary school. She loved kids, and she wanted one of her own. By then, her mom and grandmother had both died, so all of her immediate family members were gone. Losing them had been devastating, and if she wanted to have a family again, well, having a child of her own seemed like the only option. Farwell was still sexually exploiting her and had been unsympathetic when she'd lost her mom and grandmother within just a month of each other. Afterward, an aunt of Sandra's was trying to help her through the loss, and she had Sandra taken to the emergency room for a mental health evaluation because she'd become concerned that Sandra, in the wake of both these losses at once, might hurt herself. Ultimately, hospital staff determined that Sandra was not a risk to herself and they released her. But the process of being checked into the ER and being evaluated had taken hours, and during that time, she hadn't been able to communicate with Farwell, who frequently texted her and, as I mentioned earlier, kept tabs on her by tracking her phone location. So, for hours, he was able to see that she was at the hospital, but not necessarily to know what was going on. And when Sandra began texting him again, she sent him several sexual messages along with an apology for worrying him, to which, according to court documents, he coldly responded that he hadn't been worried at all. Anyway, in 2020, when Sandra told Farwell that she wanted to have a baby, he agreed to have unprotected sex with her with the intent to conceive, mostly because he was afraid that if he didn't agree, Sandra would reveal their relationship to his unsuspecting wife. Sandra had considered contacting his wife and telling her everything, but she'd promised not to do so if Farwell agreed to have unprotected sex with her with the intent to conceive. Now, Farwell did not want to have a child with Sandra, but his reluctance to do so was nothing compared to how badly he did not want his wife to find out that he'd sexually abused a 15-year-old and had been sexually exploiting her ever since.
I wonder how that's going for him now.
She knows now, that's for sure. So, unless he was going to come clean, which of course he wasn't, he had little choice but to go along with Sandra's plan. Meanwhile, a friend of Sandra's had grown concerned over the situation. That friend knew that Farwell had been sexually exploiting Sandra since childhood and was disturbed by Sandra's seemingly obsessive desire to become pregnant. They sensed that if Sandra became pregnant by Farwell, who had no intention of leaving his wife or the family they already had together, that she'd be in danger. And so the friend decided to blow the whistle on the whole thing. They called the Stoughton Police Department and told the person who answered the phone everything they knew about Sandra and Farwell's sexual relationship, including the fact that it had begun when she'd only been 15. And the response of the person who answered the phone, well, I don't know if it will surprise you, Scott, but it will disappoint you. More on that next. And now, back to Sandra's story.
We'll just start back with me guessing that it was just another layer of this onion of poor department personnel and honestly the worst of law enforcement.
Pretty much. So when a concerned friend of Sandra's called the Stoughton Police Department and told the person who answered the phone that police officer Matthew Farwell had been sexually exploiting Sandra since she'd only been 15, that person's reaction was not to go straight to a supervisor or internal affairs as would have been appropriate. Instead, they went straight to Matthew Farwell and told him about the phone call. And he was furious. He texted Sandra saying, quote, "I literally can't believe this is even real life. Like, what else do I have to worry about now? Which other friend will do something tomorrow?" End quote.
What an incompetent call taker. How stupid can somebody be?
Yeah, like somebody calls you and reports a crime and you go tell the alleged criminal. It was literally the worst possible thing they could have done. Like even keeping quiet about it and not mentioning it to anyone would have been better, because by telling Farwell, they made him angry with this vulnerable young woman. Now, unfortunately, other than Farwell being mad at Sandra, nothing came of the phone call, which Sandra's friend had hoped would put a stop to the whole sick situation. Farwell angrily told the employee who'd taken the phone call to stay quiet about it, and to the best of my knowledge, they did. Or at least, if they did tell anyone else, that hasn't been reported on and that person didn't bother to do anything about it. So, Farwell's employment at the Stoughton Police Department continued, as did Sandra's quest to become pregnant. Eventually, in December of 2020, she succeeded. She was elated when she finally got a positive pregnancy test result and immediately began making all these plans for the baby she was expecting, excitedly shopping for baby clothes and cutting back on coffee so as not to expose her child to too much caffeine in the womb.
She really was trying to be the best mother she could be.
Yeah, she was so excited. Meanwhile, Farwell, whose wife was nearly ready to give birth to their third child, was anything but thrilled. Here's how he took the news of her pregnancy, according to federal court documents. Quote, "Birchmore told Farwell that he was the child's father, and Farwell responded poorly. He became physically violent with Birchmore. She told multiple friends that Farwell had pushed and shoved her, grabbed objects from her hands, and put her in a chokehold." End quote. She also mentioned to one friend that Farwell had told her, quote, "He wished she would just die and he wanted nothing to do with the baby," end quote. Furthermore, also according to federal court documents, when Sandra told Farwell over text when her due date was and that she expected him to be with her when she went into labor, he had the audacity to respond with, quote, "You are truly the worst person on the face of the earth, ... end quote. Now, Scott, obviously, from the outside looking in, we can see the red flags. It's all we can see. But Sandra didn't have the luxury of being able to see the situation for what it really was. She'd been mistreated and exploited by this man since childhood. It was all she'd ever known. So when Farwell was angrier, more cruel, and more violent with her than he'd ever been in the past, yes, she was scared. She told a friend as much. But she didn't know what to do about it. She couldn't imagine trying to distance herself from him, and she had little idea of what a healthy relationship should be like. This had been her life since childhood.
Yeah, all those important formative and developmental years where she's trying to figure out what healthy relationships are.
And who she is as a person.
This abusive person, and I use that term lightly, has come in and violated every single aspect of what should be going on and how she should be discovering these aspects of her life.
Right. And then, in late January of 2021, Farwell exhibited what Sandra described to a friend as a 180-degree change. He came over to her apartment, brought her a ginger ale to help with pregnancy sickness, and promised to start coming around more. Oh, and he wanted a secret key to the apartment to make that easier. Previously, he'd never had or wanted a key to her home. A key would have been physical evidence tying him to her, so he'd always rejected the idea. But now he suddenly wanted a key that he made her promise not to tell anyone about. Sandra agreed, and she also noticed that during his visit, he took the time to look around her apartment, carefully inspecting the closets in particular. It was weird, but she didn't really know what to make of it. So she had a key made and gave him the passcode to her building. Despite his orders to keep this secret, she told a friend about all these events unbeknownst to him. Sandra was not a good secret keeper.
No, but at the same time, it might at least bring some level of justice.
Right. About a week later, as Sandra looked forward to becoming a mom, and investigators believe Farwell quietly seethed with anger, a winter storm rolled towards Massachusetts. It was February 1st, and the school Sandra worked at let out early for the day because of the weather. She came home to her apartment, ordered dinner for one via DoorDash, and ate alone. A few hours later, at about 9 p.m., Farwell texted her asking if he could stop by her apartment briefly. She agreed. and 3 days later, she was found dead in her apartment. When officers from the Stoughton Police Department responded to the apartment to perform a well-being check at the request of one of Sandra's co-workers, they made the discovery. They found Sandra's body sitting on the floor. A duffel bag strap was secured around her neck at one end and looped around a closet doorknob at the other. It looked as if she had committed suicide by sitting on the floor, leaning forward until she lost consciousness and ultimately dying. This method of suicide is called a seated hanging. And that's exactly what investigators from the Massachusetts State Police determined had happened. However, when relatives and friends of Sandra's responded to her apartment to clean it out in the wake of her death, they noticed things that seemed to make little sense. For example, Sandra had been in the middle of doing laundry when she died. The washer was still full of damp clothing. Plus, heartbreakingly, there was a piece of poster board she'd hand-decorated with markers and glitter to make a pregnancy announcement. This was a reminder of her intense enthusiasm over her pregnancy, a pregnancy they all believed that she'd been thrilled to live for and see through. Packages she'd ordered just before her death, all full of baby clothes and supplies, had accumulated, further demonstrating her hope for the future. In her bedroom, they found something familiar laying on the floor, a flamingo necklace that she'd often worn. The chain was broken. When federal investigators later looked at the crime scene photos, they would see that when the Stoughton police officers had found Sandra, the broken chain had still been hanging around her neck, entangled in a clump of her hair, and that the flamingo pendant had fallen onto her torso. The broken jewelry had been carelessly left behind at the scene by whoever had moved her body. Immediately after Sandra's death, a medical examiner did perform an autopsy on her body and did determine that her death had been an act of suicide. However, federal investigators say that examiner was just plain wrong. The examiner had noted that Sandra's hyoid bone had been fractured, which is virtually unheard of in seated hangings. Normally, when a hyoid bone is fractured, it's the result of either strangulation or a full body weight hanging. And that's far from the only evidence FBI investigators have amassed against Farwell. Now, we'll get to the rest of the evidence here in a bit. Meanwhile, it's important to know that in the wake of Sandra's death, investigators from the Massachusetts State Police handled the investigation. They spoke to Farwell, who told them a variety of lies, mostly designed to make Sandra look crazy and him look innocent. He claimed that there was no way he had impregnated her. They also spoke to Farwell's twin, who apparently was not quite on the same page as his brother. Farwell's twin, who was also married, by the way, told state police investigators that yes, he had also engaged in a sexual relationship with Sandra, which had continued until not long before her death. And yes, he said Sandra had told him about her pregnancy and that his brother was the father. Eventually, in the spring, Farwell was placed on administrative leave. By the time an examiner determined that Sandra had committed suicide, and yes, that she'd been somewhere between 8 and 10 weeks pregnant, basically everyone around the department knew about his sexual relationship with Sandra. Still, he hung on to his status as a police officer at the Stoughton Police Department for about another year, finally resigning in April of 2022. His twin followed suit shortly thereafter. Early that fall, the Stoughton Police Department finally concluded an internal affairs investigation into the whole thing. According to reporting for Boston.com, the investigation determined that, quote, the Farwell brothers and their former supervisor, Robert Devine, violated department rules and regulations through their conduct with Birchmore, end quote.
Okay, so what are they going to do about it?
Nothing. Classic, right?
It's one of those really annoying points where the administration within the department and the chief within the department and everybody that's overseeing it just gets to wash their hands clean of any wrongdoing by saying, yeah, we found that there was a violation, but not actually doing anything to stop it or taking any responsibility for creating this situation in the first place.
Yeah. Anyway, Scott, as I mentioned earlier, although the adults who'd raised Sandra had all died before her, she did have some relatives still living, and they cared about what had happened to her. In the wake of Sandra's death, her Aunt Darlene, her late mother's sister, took up the mantle of advocating for Sandra. In December of 2022, Sandra's estate, represented by her Aunt Darlene, filed a civil suit, a wrongful death suit, against both Farwell brothers and Devine. They alleged that if Sandra had killed herself, it was because the three officers had pushed her to do so over the course of a decade filled with, quote, grooming and repeated sexual assaults from a young age, end quote. The suit also alleged that the Stoughton Police Department had acted negligently when they'd hired the Farwell twins. And Scott, when I read why, I was practically knocked over by the wind coming off all the red flags that their reasoning raised. According to reporting by Laura Cromaldi for the Boston Globe, quote, "The Farwell brothers were hired," the lawsuit said, "even though members of the force knew that when they were teenagers, they had impersonated police officers and pulled over motor vehicles," end quote.
That's a crime, by the way.
Yeah, it is. And Scott, you know, this is an area of special interest for me professionally. We've discussed police impersonators in some past episodes. For anyone who doesn't recall, here's why I take them so seriously. We all know that certain people are drawn to the policing profession not out of altruism or any desire to help people, but out of a desire for power over others, right?
Yeah.
Those people make the worst cops, obviously. Well, imagine some individuals with that mindset, and imagine they're not even cops, but that they're just so eager to wield that kind of power over other people that they go through the trouble of breaking the law by pretending to be a police officer just to get a taste of that power.
One of my favorite things is to watch these impersonators pull over actual officers and get arrested.
It's always very satisfying.
It's such a fitting way for these people to be pulled over. And anytime we've had even rumors of police impersonators in our area, it's something that we take very seriously because these are people that are a threat to the entire society.
I keep an extensively detailed log. So, the obsession with obtaining a feeling of power and control over others that the Farwell brothers allegedly demonstrated by impersonating police officers is highly concerning. In my opinion, they never ever should have been allowed to become actual police officers. Their past police impersonation behavior had laid their motivations out on the table, and those motivations were not good. Not to mention, again, that the behavior was criminal. In any case, 3 months after Sandra's relatives filed the wrongful death lawsuit, Matthew Farwell was finally decertified as a police officer. He agreed not to seek out any future employment as a law enforcement officer, although he still refused to admit any wrongdoing. By this point, Sandra had been dead for more than 2 years. Had she lived, the baby she'd been so excited to welcome would have been about 15 months old at that point. Ironically, another 15 months would pass before there were any further developments in her case. In early summer of 2024, Sandra's family hired a pathologist named Dr. Michael Baden to review the findings of her autopsy. Dr. Baden is well known in his field, having previously served as the chief medical examiner of the city of New York. His expert opinion has influenced some of the most notorious criminal cases in U.S. history. For example, he testified in court during the O.J. Simpson trial. He was also professionally consulted by the U.S. government regarding the assassination deaths of President John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. Most recently, he weighed in on the death of Jeffrey Epstein. And those are just a few of the extremely high-profile cases he's been involved in.
This is somebody that's got a lot of cred.
Yeah, this guy's got a lot of clout. Plus, if you've ever watched HBO's Autopsy series, he's the host.
Okay, so when it comes to competent professionals, he's kind of the gold standard is what I'm getting.
Yeah, he's very respected in his field. So, Sandra's aunt wanted to know the truth about Sandra's death, and Dr. Baden, she hoped, would finally be able to either, 1, confirm her suspicions that Sandra had not committed suicide, or 2, finally put those suspicions to rest. When Dr. Baden reviewed the findings in Sandra's autopsy, he concluded that, due to the placement of the ligature that had been found around her neck and the fact that her hyoid bone had been broken, she could not possibly have committed suicide. The evidence didn't add up. He concluded that, quote, Miss Birchmore did not die of suicidal hanging. The cause of Miss Birchmore's death is strangulation, and the manner of death is homicide, end quote. Thanks to the perseverance of Sandra's aunt, Dr. Baden was hired and the truth came out. So basically what happened to Sandra was her killer strangled her, and then they staged the scene to try to make it look like she had committed a seated hanging. Just 2 months after Dr. Baden's findings, in August of 2024, Matthew Farwell was indicted by federal authorities on a first-degree murder charge. For all the reasons we've discussed so far, FBI investigators allege that Farwell murdered Sandra in order to prevent anyone from finding out about her pregnancy and to prevent anyone from finding out that he had groomed and sexually exploited her since childhood. And apparently, Farwell was pretty worried. According to court documents, after federal investigators confiscated his personal cell phone for inspection, Farwell, in a fit of genius, used his work-issued cell phone to Google things like, quote, "Can deleted cell messages be recovered by Cellebrite?" End quote.
So, first off, he's not that competent as an officer goes, because that's very basic information. Yes, it can.
The answer is yes.
Oh, sorry. I'm not actually certified in that, but I know somebody that is. I'll turn it over to a friend of mine for an expert evaluation of that statement.
That friend is me, your host, Leah, and yes, it is. So Cellebrite is an end-to-end digital forensics platform that allows law enforcement examiners to extract and analyze data from cell phones. I know because I'm a Cellebrite certified operator and Cellebrite certified physical analyst, so I've been trained in this process, as you just mentioned, Scott. And let me tell you, cell phones are treasure troves of data. If investigators can physically get a hold of a phone and access its contents, they're usually going to find out exactly what the user did on that phone. And Farwell, who apparently wasn't very tech-savvy, was, of course, no exception. In addition to a vast array of communications with and about Sandra, federal investigators discovered an assortment of disturbing material on Farwell's phone. For example, he'd saved some pro-necrophilia memes.
I wish I could say I'm surprised, but I'm not.
I don't think anything would really surprise me when it comes to this guy. To quote the court documents, quote, "Located in Farwell's iCloud were several memes that indicate his interest in sexual intercourse with dead bodies," end quote. I'll spare you the descriptions of those memes, which are included in the court documents. Investigators also discovered memes glorifying domestic and sexual violence. Most disturbingly of all, they found, quote, "a meme glorifying a person who kills and sexually abuses someone who no one will miss," end quote. Sandra was and is missed, though, by her remaining relatives, aunts and cousins, and by friends, and they had no intention of letting Farwell get away with her murder. It's because of their diligence that her case received the attention of federal authorities, who are now prosecuting Farwell for her murder. Had they not persevered and advocated for Sandra, her death might have been successfully swept under the rug. In addition to all the damning things we've just discussed, according to recent reporting by NBC Boston, prosecutors also intend to introduce DNA evidence in their case against Farwell. At the time of this recording, late 2024, Farwell is in custody and awaiting trial. Like any other defendant in the American justice system, he's innocent until proven guilty. With that being said, if he is proven guilty, he faces a minimum sentence of life imprisonment, possibly the death penalty. And statistically speaking, federal prosecutors have a conviction rate of more than 90%, and there's a wide variety of evidence available in this case. For example, the DNA evidence, the not-so-secret apartment key, and the content found on Farwell's phone. And then there's also the fact that the security cameras in Sandra's apartment building captured him arriving and leaving on the day he allegedly murdered her.
This is just one aspect of the many crimes there's evidence of him committing, but it seems like it's all pretty damning evidence.
It really does seem that way. Now, between phone activity and security cameras, they've got a pretty tight timeline locked down. So, according to federal court documents, Farwell had worn a hoodie and a surgical face mask in an effort to conceal his identity. Obviously, that didn't work. And then there's Sandra's last ever text. Before being captured on camera at her apartment complex on the day of her death, Farwell had sent her a text asking if he could drop by. Sandra had replied with a text of her own, stating that the door would be open for him when he arrived. She never texted or called anyone ever again. Her phone was locked after the text and was never unlocked until investigators obtained the device, unlocked it, and examined its contents. Prior to that, the phone had gone dead on Sandra's apartment floor, where it had lain just inches from her body.
Okay, you know when I said that very little would surprise me about Farwell?
Mm-hmm.
I will redact that statement publicly and say I am stunned by just how incompetent he can be.
Considering that he is a grown man, arguably, and a police officer, he should have seen all this coming. But he's either very stupid or very overconfident or both.
With both of us having worked in the realms of law enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
we have both seen firsthand how easy it is for people to get caught with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just baffled that somebody that's working in the field could see all of this going on around him and somehow think that he was going to just get away with it without even trying to cover up any of it.
I can't help but think that he was really banking on the fact that nobody would bother to investigate this case. Remember when Sandra's friend called the department and spilled the whole thing thinking she was like being a whistleblower? And then the employee just told him and he was like, hey, shut up about this forever. And they did. I think that's what he thought was going to go on here.
Well, welcome to federal charges and federal investigators.
Yeah. Now, when investigators examined the phone, the health data it supplied was of particular interest when it came to narrowing down a probable time of death. Here's what the federal court documents say about the health data. Quote, health data on Birchmore's phone indicates that the last movement recorded on the phone on February 1st, 2021 occurred at 9:40 p.m. That was 3 minutes before Farwell was recorded on surveillance video leaving Birchmore's apartment. Specifically, this data indicates that the mechanism that Apple uses to record movement registered 8 steps at approximately 9:40 p.m. These recorded steps occurred while Farwell was still in Birchmore's apartment. The phone recorded no additional steps between 9:40 p.m. and the time it was recovered by responders on February 4th, 2021. First responders ultimately found the phone next to Birchmore's body. End quote. Oh, and for the record, after allegedly killing Sandra, Farwell then went to a local hospital where his laboring wife delivered their 3rd child. The baby was born the following morning, approximately 12 hours after Sandra's death. As Sandra's body grew cold in a lonely apartment, Farwell held his newborn child, something that Sandra would never get to do.
He really stole everything and tried to live up her dreams. And I feel horrible for his family that's being put through this, that he tried to hide it all from.
Yeah, I don't know much about his family other than that they exist. I don't think that they were aware of any of this. I can only imagine what a nightmare it would be finding out. Speaking of family, as for Farwell's twin, William Farwell, he's no longer working as a law enforcement officer, having been decertified by the Massachusetts Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. But he's not living in Massachusetts any longer anyway. At the time of this recording, the most recent update available on him comes from a Boston.com article published in late September of 2024. According to that article, he's a member of the Arizona National Guard. Presumably, that means he's a resident of Arizona. Farwell's twin has not been charged with any crimes in relation to Sandra's life or death. Because his sexual contact with Sandra occurred after she had reached the age of 18, it was not a crime. As for Robert Devine, that's the officer who was overseeing the Police Explorers program when Sandra joined as a child and who repeatedly later ended up sexually exploiting her after she turned 18, well, he's no longer working in law enforcement either. However, according to a November 14th, 2024 article published by Boston 25 News, he is still trying to hang on to his certification as a Massachusetts law enforcement officer. Whether he'll be successful, I don't know. To the best of my knowledge, at this time, the Massachusetts Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission hasn't produced a decision yet. On that note, here's something else to consider when it comes to the gravity of Devine's actions. Scott, as we've discussed, when Robert Devine first met Sandra, he was in charge of the Police Explorers program.
Yes.
However, by the time he allegedly engaged in sex with Sandra after she had turned 18, he was no longer just an ordinary police officer. In 2013, when Sandra was 15 years old, which is when Matthew Farwell began sexually abusing her, by the way, Robert Devine was appointed to the position of Deputy Police Chief of the entire Stoughton Police Department.
That was one of those nice long breaks that we had to cut because of how incredibly hard my eyes were rolling at how despicable this human being is.
Yeah, so this disgusting scandal went all the way to the top of the department. So, while Sandra, still a child, was being sexually abused by a Stoughton police officer, Robert Devine was second in command at that department. His time in this prestigious position only lasted for a few years, though, because in 2016, by which time Sandra was 18 years old and Robert Devine was reportedly having sex with her, he was demoted. Demoted all the way from deputy chief of the entire department to the starting position of regular patrol officer.
That's one of those classic things that I always question. If you lose that much rank, how do you go back to being a normal officer? I mean, let's not even kid ourselves. By the time somebody's a deputy chief, most of the time, they have lost all of the skills and knowledge that are required for a patrol officer.
It's usually been many, many years since they were in a patrol position.
you might as well be having a new recruit in that position because they don't do that job anymore when they're an administrator. How do you expect them to be a patrol officer? And if you're demoted to that point, how do you look at your coworkers in the face and be like, yeah, I'm one of you now?
I'm sure every day was so humiliating for him, which brings me great joy. Anyway, Scott, it probably won't surprise you to learn that Divine's demotion was the result of a sexual scandal.
More than one?
Yes, let me be clear. The scandal that resulted in his demotion had nothing to do with Sandra. None of that had come to light yet. To be frank, an entire podcast episode could easily be made about the liberties former Stoughton Deputy Police Chief Robert Divine took with his authority. But in the interest of respecting everyone's time, allow me to summarize. Divine once had an extramarital affair with an adult woman, which came to light when the woman repeatedly contacted his wife, allegedly harassing her and Divine. And it turned into a big, dramatic mess of a situation. At one point, someone emailed a bunch of photos of Divine and this woman having sex, not only to Divine's wife and other family members, but also to his co-workers at the police department and even those co-workers' spouses. Divine handled this poorly. Even after he and his wife obtained harassment protection orders against his affair partner, he continued to meet up with her for sexual encounters, later offering the excuse that she had threatened to commit suicide if he didn't continue his relationship with her. So gosh, Scott, I guess that these repeated sexual encounters were really life-saving measures if you think about it. What a hero.
Protecting and serving all the way.
Anyway, Divine's affair partner ended up having her house searched, her electronics seized, and being arrested. At one point, someone also got into her apartment and ransacked the place. No one has ever admitted to that. They didn't force entry, I'll tell you that much.
All I'm saying here is that seems like a lot of special attention that isn't applied to the average citizen.
Doesn't it?
And it seems like a gross misuse of position and power.
I agree. On that note, ultimately, this drama concluded, more or less, when it was determined that Divine had abused his authority during the ordeal. For this, he was demoted all the way down to the position of patrol officer. Scott, can you imagine being pulled over by a patrol cop and this middle-aged man gets out of the car and you recognize him from the news and you're like, hey, aren't you that former deputy chief who was demoted to the streets after you heroically saved that woman's life by having sex with her? Bravo.
I think that they thought he would have had the self-respect to just resign in defeat, but he understands that he has absolutely nothing of value to offer any other future employer, and he was begging for the table scraps he was allowed to keep.
Yeah, if they thought he had self-respect, they were way wrong. Also, what I want to know, did he get to keep his deputy chief's salary while he was on patrol? Anyway, some people, such as the then Stoughton police chief, did not feel that the demotion was a severe enough consequence for Divine. He wanted Divine fired, but the town manager had different ideas. This whole keeping him on as a patrol officer was the town manager's idea. I don't know why, but because of this, the chief himself resigned, refusing to work for a department that would continue to employ Divine.
I really wish we could catch up with him now to see what he thinks about everything that's unfolded since that came out.
Well, here's what he thought about everything at the time. He said, quote, "The town manager cut me out of the entire process of an employee in my department. He made a deal without even talking to me. I wasn't even allowed to speak to the lawyer handling my employee. There was such a serious breach of courtesy and dignity. I won't work for someone with no credibility. My integrity is worth too much." End quote. So, although Divine's involvement in Sandra's case is definitely the worst scandal he's been involved in, it's not the first. Actually, it's allegedly not even the second. The civil suit filed against Divine by Sandra's aunt alleges that years before Divine became involved with Sandra, he had an inappropriate relationship with a middle school girl who was a participant in an after-school program he ran then. At the time of this recording, Divine is not employed as a law enforcement officer. Whether or not he'll be allowed to hang on to his certification remains to be seen. He had a hearing with the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission in mid-November 2024. A decision is forthcoming at the time of this recording. Meanwhile, to the best of public knowledge, Divine still resides near Stoughton. He has not been charged with any crime in relation to Sandra's life or death. Because his sexual contact with Sandra occurred after she had reached the age of 18, it was not a crime. As for Joshua Heel, the animal control officer who had sexual relations with Sandra, At the time of this recording, he also still retains his certification as a police officer. In 2020, he left his position as animal control officer at Stoughton to work as a police officer in the nearby town of Abington, Massachusetts. The following year, 2021, the year of Sandra's murder, he was appointed to the position of school resource officer.
What a horrible place to put him.
Yeah, just where you'd want him, right? So later that year, he was interviewed for the first time by Stoughton officers who were in the middle of their investigation into the police misconduct involving Sandra. Those events had ballooned into an enormous internal affairs investigation at Stoughton. According to Boston 25 News, Joshua Heel was deceitful during his interviews with Stoughton. The chief of the Stoughton Police Department eventually reached out to the chief of the Abington Police Department, warning him that he'd, quote, found Josh Heel to be not credible because Josh denied having a sexual relationship with Birchmore during the first interview, but had changed his answer in the second interview, end quote.
So if I'm a defense lawyer and Joshua Heel ever goes to court for any charges that he may levy against any individual, I am using all of this.
His established history as a liar? Yeah. Now, Heel retained his employment with the Abington Police Department until February of 2023, when he was allowed to, quote, resign in lieu of punishment, end quote. At the time of this recording, although he's not employed in a law enforcement role, he still maintains his certification as a Massachusetts police officer. As long as that remains the case, he could potentially work again as a law enforcement officer. All it would take would be a department willing to hire him, and the same goes for Robert Devine, as long as he holds on to his certification.
I wish I could say there weren't, but we have many cases of departments that are desperate for officers that are willing to take another department's trash.
It's not uncommon at all. Now, the chief of the Abington Police Department has recommended that the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission decertify Heel. Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. At the time of this recording, to the best of public knowledge, Joshua Heel resides near the Stoughton area. He has not been charged with any crime related to Sandra's life or death. Because his sexual contact with Sandra occurred after she had reached the age of 18, it was not a crime. As for Sandra, she, of course, will never move to another town or start a new job because she's dead. If alive at the time of this recording, she would be 27 years old and her baby would be 2 years old and about to celebrate their third Christmas. It's too late for anyone to help Sandra or her baby. However, we can, at the very least, try to make sure that some degree of good comes from her death. I guarantee you there are other Sandras out there, so to speak, and other Matthew Farwells. There are many victims of sexual violence who it's not too late to help, and their stories don't have to end in death like Sandra's did. Many of you listening have probably heard of RAINN, a nonprofit that holds the title of the U.S.'s largest anti-sexual violence organization. They operate a well-known hotline for victims of sexual abuse, and while that's incredibly important, it's only a fraction of what they do. Behind the scenes, they also help an average of 844 survivors every day through their victim services programs, educate more than 130 million people each year on prevention and recovery through relationships with the entertainment industry, the media, and local communities. And they promote sexual assault laws and policies to ensure that survivors get the justice they deserve, including the expanded use of DNA to eliminate the backlog of untested rape kits. RAINN is a respected nonprofit, and 87 cents of every dollar goes directly to aiding victims of sexual abuse. If you were moved by Sandra's story and would like to do something to honor her memory, we ask that you please consider making a donation to RAINN in her memory. You can do so at rainn.org, that's RAINN.org. There's a section on the donation form you can fill out to dedicate your gift to her memory. And if that's not something you're able to do at this time, no worries, you're still contributing in a very real way. Scott and I are making a donation of our own in memory of Sandra, and frankly, we're able to do so because of the advertisements you hear during breaks in our episodes, including this one. So, thank you very much. Our gift to RAINN in memory of Sandra is very much your gift as well. And before we conclude this episode, we've got some good news. Scott, would you like to deliver that?
I would. As I'm sure those of you who've been listening to Lasting Alive since the early days have noticed, our production and audio quality has improved significantly over the years. Lately, we've been working on remaking our earlier episodes. When we originally recorded them, we were doing the very best we could and knew how to at the time. However, our best wasn't that great, and we've learned a lot since then. and made significant improvements in the equipment we've used since the days of our single Amazon mic.
Yeah. RIP the $30 Amazon mic.
And not to mention just a child's bed and a blanket stapled to the wall.
It was a rudimentary setup at the time.
However, we really want to honor those victims by telling their stories with the production quality they deserve. So we've been completely remaking all of our early episodes. I'm talking totally new recordings with new info and updates if they're available. And we'll be releasing those new episodes on what were previously our off Mondays. So that means there will be an episode of Last Seen Alive airing every single Monday. It'll alternate between totally new cases we've never covered before, as usual, and revisiting the remade episodes on the Mondays in between. We're starting immediately, and we're going to continue until we feel all of our episodes are up to par. So we'll see you next Monday, and the next, and the next.
With all of that being said, if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved disappearance of Gretchen Fleming. The two episodes aren't related, but there are some similarities. Gretchen was a woman in her 20s. She was last seen with a disgraced cop who is believed to be connected to her disappearance. We aired that episode in January of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast and our TikTok, Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. And if you think bringing unsolved cases like Sandra's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. And don't forget, check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Dope Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.